Last week, if you weren't with us, or even if you were, we started this series called Humbled King, in which what we're exploring is this suggestion that what if we can look at what were Jesus' favorite parts of the Bible, and those parts that most shaped the way he related to God and understood God and represented God and followed God. And that's not to say, of course, that Jesus had a Bible or even that he had his own Torah scroll. That seems unlikely. It was a memorizing culture, but it is a way of just saying that what we can do is we can look at the gospel accounts and the way the authors wrote the Old Testament into those accounts. And what we can do is look at the gospel accounts for the way they give us Jesus and both what he said and what he did. And there's this really strong overlap between a particular story in Isaiah 40 to 55 that it overlaps very strongly the way Jesus seemed to live and breathe and find his being in God. And so what we're doing is saying, hey, we can use this because quite frankly, we live in this world where there are a sea of options. In fact, last week I used Mr. Potato Head, and I bought a Mrs. Potato Head, and then I didn't think it was going to get here in time, so I didn't rehearse with Mrs. Potato Head, and then it showed up at my house yesterday. So next week I'll bring Mrs. Potato Head, just so that we're covered. But what we did is we used Mr. Potato Head, and it's 20-some different pieces, multiple tongue options, and eyeball options, and hat options, and arm options, to just illustrate, and there was some debate how exactly you figure out the math of how many options of variation are there with Mr. Potato Head. I had people texting me. Jack Robowiser, the old Carroll math prof, was texting me like, I think you do it this way, so thanks, Jack. I don't think I ever got back to you. Thank you for that. But all the same, there's somewhere around 1 billion options. And we use that to say, that's kind of how the God thing works. And maybe you're here and you're a little bit skeptical, or maybe God doesn't work for you as well as he used to because you're more and more aware that there are so many options and so many opinions and so many good people subscribing to all those various different options that it just seems absurd that you can figure it out. And I don't even know that I disagree with you. To me, where I find hope, and I guess what I'm trying to do in this series is illustrate that what we can do is we can look at Christ. We can look at the person of Jesus, and we can ask ourselves, how did he put the pieces together? How did he understand God? How did he relate to God? And in the words of the late Dallas Willard, to just go like, I know there's other options, or however those work, I don't need to worry about it, but I think the way Dallas said it is, I know of Jesus, and I know of no better option. And so we can just go with, how did he relate to God? So that's what we're going to do this morning. This morning, what I'm going to do, there's a really strong theme that I want to pull out this morning, which is kind of building in this series. It requires that I read a lot from the Bible. So if you're like a lots of Bible person, this is your morning, because I think I'm going to read from the Bible more this morning than I ever have in my 20 years, maybe cumulatively more than I have in the whole 2020. I don't know. But we're going to look at a few different places to try to create this arc that hopefully helps you move towards Christmas and maybe even move towards Christ a little bit better in this season. So I'm going to start in chapter 41. Last week, we had developed this idea of a God who first and foremost comes from a posture of compassion and kindness and mercy. Here we go in verse 41. Listen to me in silence, O coastlands. Let the peoples renew their strength. Let them approach, then let them speak. Let us together draw near for judgment. So what you have is a group of people who are looking at something happening in the world, and they're going, what is happening? Let's draw near and try to figure this thing out. Who has roused a victor from the east, summoned him to his service? He delivers up nations to him, and he tramples kings underfoot. He makes them like dust with his sword, like driven stubble with his bow. He pursues them and passes on safely, scarcely touching the path with his feet. So it's like everything comes easy to this person. Who has performed and done this, calling the generations from the beginning? So contextually, what you have is something's happening in the world, something disturbing. There's what you might call an unknown future. Like there's a disruption, and nobody can quite figure out either what's going on or where it's leading or even who's behind it. And then Isaiah says this, I, the Lord, am first and will be the last. You know, in sports, we'll say things like, he plays third base like he invented the position. God's going, I'm the one behind all this. I'm the one working. The coastland, and now what you're getting at is, here's how other people are responding. The coastlands have seen and are afraid. The ends of the earth tremble. They have drawn near and come. So they're freaking out. What's going on? Each one helps the other, saying to one another, take courage. So they're even helping each other rationalize. The artisan encourages the goldsmith, and the one who smooths with the hammer encourages the one who strikes the anvil, saying of the soldering, it is good. and they fashion it with nails so that it cannot be moved. So you're dealing with an ancient Near Eastern culture that's much more bathed in God than our own, who's now turning to these different cultural ideas of God and finding comfort in those iterations of God. And then it says this, but you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, the offspring of Abraham, my friend. Here's why. Now, the extent to which this view is accurate, this makes this verse one of the pinnacle points of the entire Jewish narrative, especially as we look to Christ, because this is, according to many, including N.T. Wright, the first place in the Old Testament, in the Jewish Bible, where Israel is explicitly referred to as a servant. So there's a couple things going on here. First, God is saying, hey, I'm behind this. And second, he's reminding these people of their role in the problem. You whom I took from the ends of the earth and called from its farthest corners, saying to you, here it is again, you are my servant. I've chosen you and not cast you off. There's this fascinating study about where did Israel come from? And one of the simple answers is there were these like marginalized people scattered across the ancient Near East, and God brought them together to form for himself a people. Do not fear, for I'm with you. Do not be afraid, for I'm your God. I will strengthen you and I will help you. I will uphold you with my victorious right hand. Now, we're going to return to these fear passages next week because I think Jesus clearly gets that theme from his Gospels, from this story. But notice the theme here you have is a God who's reminding Israel, first of all, you're mine. I'm with you. And second of all, you have a job to do, and it's to be a servant. You know, we moved towards Thanksgiving a couple weeks ago with a one-off in-between series message where I just suggested, what happens if you do the work of gratitude as you move towards Thanksgiving? And really the question was, in spite of COVID, what can we be thankful for? Which, my intention there isn't to trivialize COVID or your specific or the world's collective kind of pain and suffering around COVID, but just to say, like, wait a minute, the power of bad is always going to be pervasive. How do we do the hard work of gratitude? And, you know, if you were to ask me that question, one of my answers would be my sense of vocation is more clear than it's ever been. And I suspect that the same thing is true of many of you. What I've realized is, and I've told this story a lot, but at 20 years old, I became the intern of a youth ministry that was led by a guy named Vern Streeter, who in hindsight was one of the single most talented people I've ever known personally. Like when I started working in that youth ministry, on an average Wednesday night, there were 150, as many as 200 students in the room. And they weren't there because they had to be. They were there because Vern was hilarious. He was charismatic. He was incredible at creating gatherings and experiences. He was great at creating this context for learning and growth and challenge. And he could gather a crowd. In fact, after that year, I stayed in the internship position that I was in. He went and planted a church, and by Christmas of that first year of there being a church together, there was 1,000 people in that community. Now, granted, he planted a church in the town in which he came from, so there's nuances to that, but he was remarkable at creating experiences. It's, to this day, one of the biggest churches in the state. The second year, I worked for a guy named Brian Hopkins, who is in every level Vern's equal. He also is great at forming crowds. He planted a church in Bozeman. In fact, I remember when I was interning with him, or actually I think it was the first year that we started the youth ministry at Harvest, we teamed up with Brian. There was this conference in Minneapolis in like late January, early February that he wanted to take students to. We ended up having to rent 13, 15 passenger vans. And in late January, drove from Billings to Minneapolis. I still remember standing at the gas pump in Fargo. It was like 7 o'clock at night. It was negative 400 degrees. The wind was blowing sideways. I still remember standing there having a minor anxiety attack going like, what are we doing with all these students here at this time of year? Now, I don't think it was about ego for them. I think they arrive very genuinely at this place of wanting to make Jesus as available as possible to as many people as possible. And I think they have some unique skill set to do that. But what I've realized in this season is I think I've primarily, up until real recently, and I still probably am working through this, identified as, I don't know, entertainer, event creator, teacher. And I'm not apologizing for any of that. I think, I look at Jesus. Jesus identified primarily as a rabbi, a teacher of the scriptures, a friend to people. But what Jesus did unique is he nuanced that. His occupation might have been rabbi, but vocationally, who was he? He was a servant. He said things like, even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve others. I wonder if one of the great values of COVID is this realization that for all of us, the why behind the what is really being refined. Because I think for probably many of us, before COVID, we had jobs that supported the life that we mostly wanted to live. It paid the mortgage, it paid for our skis, whatever. But suddenly, like even going to work, it requires a strong sense of why, doesn't it? I mean, I'm not a teacher, but the conversations I've had with teachers, like the risk involved, the sacrifice, like what it takes to do your job and serve those that you serve, it's different. It goes without saying that those of you who are nurses or doctors or in any way working in that health profession, even being a parent, whether you're a stay-at-home parent, I think for athletes, I mean, just the whole gamut, no matter what we do, there's this invitation, I think, to go, okay, so your occupation, so you're a spouse, so you're a basketball player, so you work for the federal government, so you work for Blue Cross, that's your occupation. But what we're going to get at in this story is a God who's reminding Israel, this is my world, I'm king, and I use servants within it. It's the divine conspiracy. Listen, I'm so grateful for Fred and the way that he kind of helped me get here, and I've refined this in this season, but I love what I do. I would miss it dearly if this wasn't my job anymore, but for me, and this is my hope for all of us, COVID has refined the vocational piece. Like, I'm now aware, like, and I know that hindsight's, whatever, that this is probably easier than it would really be, or sounds easier than it is, but I'm pretty confident I'd still get up in the morning before work and spend time in the scriptures, and I'm not suggesting that I'm the ideal type, just my rhythm, and I'm convinced that I would still find time in my day to go for walks and have conversations, and I'd still be a voracious reader, and I'd still be looking for people to share community with and to serve people with. See, what's going on here in this story is a God who's going, hey, I know you're a teacher, I know you're a nurse, I know you're a mom, but my invitation was that you would be a servant. And what this moves into within this narrative is there's these 4 songs, and actually I started studying this kind of out of a place of shame because I'd heard people like N.T. Wright say, these 4 suffering servant songs are so important, and their value is always lost on me. We're going to look at, I think, 3 of them here this morning. 42. Here's my servant. So there it is again. Whom I uphold, my chosen, and whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him, and he will bring forth justice to the nations. Now, if you're going like, that sounds familiar, good on you, that's almost exactly Matthew's quotation at Jesus' baptism. We're going to talk on Easter how, again, this is a point where Jesus identifies with this role. He will not cry or lift up his voice or make it heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, and a dimly burning wick he will not quench. He will faithfully bring forth justice. Couple important things here. First of all, we're talking not about a person. If we're being honest in the way the text was originally read and experienced, we're talking about ideal Israel. Again, this is a God who observes things happening in the world, and he's going, Israel, you're my answer to all of this. And notice again the compassion, the gentleness, the kindness. I think we can all picture lighting the birthday cake. And if someone so much as sneezes, which is now a crime, like how easily that flame is put out. The idea here is this Israel, this people, these people, will exist in such a way that they'll have what we might call high emotional intelligence, high awareness of others, incredible kindness and respect for those around. Like they don't even snuff out the least of these. He will not grow faint or be crushed until he has established justice in the earth, and the coastlands wait for his teaching. Who lives on the coastlands? Not Israel. Again, it's a foreshadowing or a retelling of the story of a God who wasn't just after Israel. We see this even in the Exodus story. God is using Israel to get to Egypt as much as anything. A God who wants to bring blessing to the world. I wonder how many of you are familiar with Pat Lencioni. If you've read anything from him, you'll know quickly that he's one of the most readable leadership people out there. His most recent book is a book called The Motive. I highly, highly, highly recommend it. In fact, for me, it became almost a commentary to the book of Isaiah or these chapters of Isaiah several months ago. What makes Lencioni so readable is he takes a principle, and oftentimes he works with one, which is why I suppose he has 16 books, or something like that, but he writes it into fable. And so he doesn't give you the classic kind of business didactic lecture. He gives you this very well-crafted short story, usually they're about 80 to 100 pages long, in which he takes his principles and he weaves them into a story that involves characters and people and arc and tension and all the things good stories do. Well, his most recent book is a book called The Motive. I think I've heard him say on podcasts now, he's a good one to just type into your podcast thing, and frankly, he gives it all away in podcast if you'd rather listen. But he says this is the book that everyone should start with from everything he's ever done. The story features a CEO from the LA area. I forget his name. I think his name is Liam or something like that. I better look because I have a quote that I wanted to read here. Shay is the guy's name. Shay is the CEO of a company in the LA area. I forget exactly what they do, but it's the type of company that's doing okay, and he's the CEO, and he's doing okay, and he kind of likes it, and his staff is kind of doing okay. But mostly they're feeling the pressure from a national brand that seems to be crowding in on their market. Well, Shay is aware of another similar company that's in the San Diego area that is in the same business and has the same dynamics and is also kind of dealing with this national brand. But what's unique about the guy in San Diego is his company in the last few years has really started to do very well. They're out competing even Shay's company. And so Shay, in his kind of executive brazenness, decides that what he's going to do to solve his company's problems is buy the company in San Diego, help them kind of form their fence against this national brand and also make their numbers look better for their directors. So in the process, Shay reaches out to the CEO of this company in San Diego, and to the credit of the guy in San Diego, he gets in his car and drives up to LA and starts spending time with Shay. Part of him is trying to protect his own company, and part of him is trying to help Shay because he gathers that Shay's struggling. Well, in the midst of that, in the course of that relationship early on, the guy from San Diego the guy from San Diego shares with Shay that really the secret sauce, the thing that changed everything for him, was he hired a particular executive coach. And really what he shares is it wasn't so much the coach as it was this one particular question that she asked him. And so this is where Lencioni becomes great, and he kind of teases this out for multiple chapters. And eventually you get to the question, and the question that is finally formed is he says, Shay, we can go to that next slide, why do you want to be CEO? And in doing what he's kind of doing is cutting at, like, we all assume that we know the answer to that, but why? And Shay quickly starts to talk, and this guy stops him. He's like, Shay, I just want you to think about this. So he thinks for 5 seconds. He's a verbal processor, maybe like you and I. And again, the guy stops him. Just give it a minute. And so there's this kind of start-stop thing that happens, and finally, after what seems like hours, Shay looks at this guy, and he says, I don't know. I guess my answer to the question is, I don't know why I want to be CEO. And then I think he proves his intelligence and just awareness by he goes, well, why do you want to be CEO? And that's what this guy says. He says, Shay, I want to be CEO because I see my job as a responsibility and a sacrifice. You're CEO because you see your job as a reward. What he goes on to point out is what changed for me was when I fundamentally understood this isn't about just a natural entitlement because I ascended the organizational ladder. I am the organization's primary servant. It's not so much a privilege as it is a responsibility. And that, to me, is exactly what's going on in this Isaiah section. And I think it might be what COVID can do for all of us. Why? Why do you work there? Why are you in that relationship? Why do we want to be on that team? What's the why behind the what? And this is what I think God is leading them through. Let's look at 46, which is not, by the way, a suffering servant song, but this remarkable, remarkable image. In 46:1, it says, Bel bows down, Nebo stoops. Their idols are on beasts and cattle. These things you carry are loaded as burdens on weary animals. Bel and Nebo are our Babylonian gods. They stoop, they bow down together. They cannot save the burden, but themselves go into captivity. The image here is the Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade. And what's going on is these Babylonian gods, are being paraded through town on the backs of these animals. So they are carried by these animals. And then listen to what God does. Listen to me, O house of Jacob, all the remnant of the house of Israel. You have been born by me from birth, carried from the womb. Even to your old age, I am he. Even when you turn gray, I will carry you. I have made, and I will bear. I will carry, and will save. The image here is God's going, listen, I understand how these other ideas work and these other gods work. You carry them. But here's who I am. I carry you. And then we get into the suffering servant song of 49. Excuse me, I know that's a crime, but I've got something in the back of my throat. Listen to me, O coastlands. Pay attention, you peoples from far away. The Lord called me before I was born. While I was in my mother's womb, he named me. He made my mouth like a sharp sword. In the shadow of his hand, he hid me. He made me a polished arrow. In his quiver, he hid me away. See, if you're going like, wait a minute, are we now talking about a person? That's exactly what's happening here is there's this like, wait a minute, is this now a person? And he said to me, you are my servant, Israel, in whom I am glorified. But I said, I have labored in vain. I've spent my strength for nothing in vanity. Yet surely my cause is with the Lord and my reward with my God. Now the Lord says, who formed me in the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob back to him, and that Israel might be gathered to him. For I am honored in the sight of the Lord, and my God has become my strength. He says, it is too light a thing that you should be my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the survivors of Israel. I will give you as a light to the nations, and my salvation may reach to the end of the earth. See, here's the culminating arc of the story. Is what's happening here is God is going, okay, you won't do it, so I'll do it. What's happening here is a God who's going, Israel, I made you to lead through service. This is how God becomes king. And after Adam and Eve and Abraham and the people of Israel and the desert and Moses and all of that, this is the point, according to some in the text, where God goes, I'll do it. On the one hand, I'm not asking you to do something I won't do, but on the other hand, God's going, I'll carry this. I will do this. Now, to be fair, I think we have to say, it's not like a bunch of people in Jesus' day were sitting around reading the story going, oh, so this is the Messiah. That's the trick of all this. That's the compassion of all this. I think that's why I don't think we're supposed to read the Gospels and go, well, I would have got this right, even though they missed it. The idea here isn't that Jesus invented a new way of understanding God or relating to God. The idea is Jesus caught something that everybody else missed. Remember, Paul says the collision at the cross was the way the world does power with the way God does power. The foolish wisdom of the world versus the foolishness of God. That's the collision. God goes, I'll do it. But nobody saw this. Nobody saw it until after. That's why Jesus died at the cross alone. Nobody expected the Messiah to serve this role, but what turned the world upside down after the resurrection was this like, oh, like back there where he said, I'll put my spirit on him and he'll be a blessing. Oh, God did what we weren't able to do. And this becomes the culminating suffering servant song that I'm not going to put on the screen. I'm just going to read to you. It's long. And again, as I read this, please remember, this is not written after Jesus. It's written hundreds of years before Jesus was born. See, my servant shall prosper. He shall be exalted and lifted up and shall be very high. Just as there are many who were astonished at him, so marred was his appearance beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of mortals. So he shall startle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. We sing a song with that line. For that which had not been told them they shall see, and that which they had not heard they shall contemplate. Who has believed what we have heard? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity. And as one from whom others hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him of no account. Surely he has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases. Yet we accounted him stricken, struck down by God and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of it all. See, the thought was Israel would do this, and Jesus shows up and goes, I'll do it. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter and like a sheep that before its shears is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By a perversion of justice he was taken away. Who could have imagined his future? For he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. They made his grave with the wicked and his tomb with the rich, although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain. When you make his life an offering for sin, he shall see his offspring and shall prolong his days. Through him the will of the Lord shall prosper. Here again is this vocation of service. Out of his anguish he shall see light. He shall find satisfaction through his knowledge. The righteous one, my servant, shall make many righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will allot with him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured himself out to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. It's like the message is, the bad news is, you don't know what the future holds. But the good news is, your vocation is secure. As one called to follow in the line of Christ and how he becomes king through the self-giving love of God. So let's take communion, because I think that this is exactly what Jesus was doing. If you'll grab your Happy Meal, and there should be some Dixie cups in there. You can pour yourself a little glass of juice, and there's like a small meal and just the smallest bite of that bread, so be careful. So good. Jerry Startall makes the bread for us. See, suddenly the New Testament story comes crashing down, right? You can see how the gospel writers and guys like Paul were like, oh. Because on the night he was betrayed, Jesus took bread. He broke it and he said, hey, this is my body broken for you. I am the suffering servant, and so let's take the bread together. And then he took the cup, and he said, this wine represents my blood poured out for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Remember, this is a story of what he did and what it means to be his. So let's take the wine together, or the juice. It seems that the probing question of the key Jesus narrative is this question of, so why do you want to be CEO? How do you understand yourself and what it means to be a parent, to be a spouse, to be an employee, to be an owner, to be a community member, to be a neighbor? How did God become king, and how will you? And what if the great assurance of this is you have all the security you need? The invitation to enter into life as servant, no matter what the occupation, the season of life happens to be. So let me pray for you, God. Thanks, Lord, that Jesus was attached to this meta-narrative that, Lord, just for me brings tremendous comfort to know that he also had a library of options to choose from, and that the way he chose to relate to you, that's the way he chose to serve you, the way he chose to project you, the way he chose to invite others to follow you, was in one sense incredibly radical and rare, but in another sense very grounded in the story. And I pray that the message would not be this arrogant, like we got right what everybody else missed, but this realization of, oh, go, yeah, we drove by that one all the time too, and thank you, Jesus, for finding that thread. Jesus, I pray for schools and clinics and homes and neighborhoods and big businesses and small businesses and state government places and federal government places, that because of your divine conspiracy, that of Christ living in people and working itself through the cracks, that there's hope, that the suffering servant narrative continues on through the lives of people. God, would you help us identify those moments when we miss it and find our way back onto that horse? We love you. Amen.
If you would like to learn more about Narrate Church, find us at narratechurch.org or look us up on Facebook and Instagram.